Section 1 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. Introduction. This paper is an attempt to give the most accurate facts obtainable bearing upon the question of colored domestic service in Philadelphia. It endeavors to show the relation of the colored domestic to the general domestic service problem on the one hand, and to the great mass of the Negro people on the other. The purpose, scope, and methods of the work are the same as those already explained at length by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois in the introduction to this volume, constituting the general report of the investigation conducted by the University of Pennsylvania. The section treating domestic service is no unimportant division of the general subject. On the contrary, it is probably of more consequence than any other single aspect of the problem, since the number of domestic servants among colored wage earners is shown by the last census to be greater in 32 out of 48 states than the number engaged in any other occupation, while in many cases it is greater than the number engaged in all other employments taken together. Indeed, this predominance of domestic service over all other occupations followed by the Negroes is recorded of every state in the Union, excepting the Southern states where agriculture stands first and domestic service second. It would doubtless be surprising to many to hear that the census record shows that each of the northern and western states, with the single exception of Delaware, has more colored people in domestic service than in any other occupation, while in nearly 7 in every 10 of these states colored domestic service more than outnumbers the aggregate of all other occupations of colored people. The record for the state of Pennsylvania, as given by the last census, shows the following facts concerning occupations of Negroes throughout the state. It appears from the statistics that nearly 60% of the colored working men of Pennsylvania are engaged in domestic service, while over 91% of the colored working women of the state are in service. A graphic presentation of these facts makes clear the large proportion of the Negro population of Pennsylvania employed in domestic service. In the city of Philadelphia, nearly the same preponderance of domestic service in relation to other occupations of the colored people is found. In this investigation, a separate schedule for domestic service was used. Like the other schedules, it was prepared under the direction of Dr. S. M. Lindsay, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and was carefully revised by the National Department of Labor at Washington, as well as by prominent statisticians in New York and elsewhere. The facts here given were collected during a 9 months residence at the Philadelphia College settlement, which is located in the heart of one of the most densely populated Negro quarters of the city. This schedule was used throughout the residence streets of the 7th Ward and elsewhere in the ward limits, wherever colored domestics were employed. This ward includes among its inhabitants all grades of wealth and comfort, from the houses with a coachman and coachman's assistant, a butler and butler's assistants, and a retinue of female domestics as well, to those houses where only one woman is employed, who does general housework, sometimes including not only cooking and laundry work, but also the furnace work, removal of ashes, cleaning the front, and other outside work usually delegated to a man. And thus, since nearly all degrees of wealth are represented in the district investigated, that is to say, from the present point of view, all grades of service employing families, it is probable that all grades of colored domestic service have been encountered in this survey. In this house-to-house canvass, every domestic scheduled, with a very few exceptions, was personally interviewed. Occasionally the butler or waiter would answer for the cook, if both chanced to have served long in the same family, or sometimes the lady of the house would herself supply the answers, but in every case the information given was such as to warrant belief in its reliability. To the domestic servants personally interviewed in this way have been added the far greater number scheduled by Dr. Du Bois in his canvass of the homes of the colored people within the ward limits. Altogether 677 men have been recorded, and 1,612 women, making a total of 2,289 domestics, male and female, either working or living in the 7th Ward. End of section 1. Section 2 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Enumeration of Negro Domestic Servants. Recent reform in domestic service. Reform in the administration of the household has been called a belated reform, one that has been so long a time in gaining the ear of intelligent people that it must somehow make up for lost time and gain a little on other reforms before it can hope to come abreast of the progress of the age. In view of the fact that college-bred women in greater numbers are assuming responsibility for the administration of the household at the same time that reform of domestic service is being agitated, it is natural to think that the one thing partly accounts for the other. It is certainly true that the question is now, for the first time, being treated scientifically by some of the most intelligent women in the country. The Civic Club of Philadelphia has done honorable pioneer work in attempting to establish a standard of work and wages for domestic servants, and other similar clubs are following in their footsteps. Also, there is beginning to be a literature on the subject, best represented by Charles Booth's study of household service in the 8th volume of his Life and Labor of the People, and by the admirable work entitled Domestic Service by Miss Lucy M. Salmon, Professor of History at Vassar College. In the latter work, which is easily the best authority on this much discussed but little understood subject, the doctrine of survival through adaptation is for the first time applied to the economics of the household. One result has been the conviction that much of the friction in the modern household arises from its lack of adaptation to the civilization of today, and will disappear when domestic service gets in line with the march of progress and ceases to try to meet modern needs by the employment of medieval methods. The higher is dependent on the lower, and as our social reforms deal with the houses and food of the poor for the sake of higher things than mere physical well-being, so all our reforms must begin at the bottom and work up. We may take courage that reforms in domestic service and in household economics will spread, since they have now ceased to be regarded as impossibilities, and the problems involved are being fairly faced. With the widening of woman's mental horizon has come a realizing sense of the truth regarding household work, that in no other occupation is there so much waste of labor and capital and in no other would a fraction of this waste be overlooked. This report endeavors to contribute to the problem the results of a study of facts concerning the domestic work of Negroes in Philadelphia. Enumeration. In presenting these facts, we shall begin with an enumeration of Negro domestics. The first table shows the number of colored domestic servants in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia by sex and age periods. From this statement it will be seen that of the colored service in the ward, about 30% is furnished by men and 70% by women. In the 7th Ward of Philadelphia there were found to be 9,675 colored persons, of whom 2,289 are here seen to be domestic employees, or 23.7% of the total colored population of the ward. It is a little over 30% of all the colored wage earners of the ward. This percent in domestic service agrees very nearly with the following table, taken from the 11th census, showing the proportion of Negro wage earners engaged in domestic service the country over to be 31.4 to the 100. When public waiters and waitresses in hotels and restaurants, as well as janitors and caretakers, are included in the count of domestic servants, it brings the ratio up nearly to 41% of the whole number colored wage earners in the ward. After considering what percent of the colored people are domestics, it is interesting to notice what part of domestic service is colored. So we turn from the ratios just given to consider what proportion of the total of domestic service in the United States is performed by colored people. When we think of American domestic service as a whole, we have a more or less clear conception of a great army, of the colored race in the South, of the Irish and Germans in the North, of the Swedes in the Middle West, and of the Chinese on the Pacific coast. The census of 1890 gives the relative numbers of native white, foreign white, and colored, including Chinese, domestic employees in the United States as follows. For the native white, the figure is 41.65%. For foreign white, 29.55%. These figures attribute nearly 29% of the domestic service of the country to the colored, who comprise only 12.5% of the population. The colored perform about 3 times as much domestic service in proportion to their numbers as the whites do. From this it will be seen that while the study of domestic service and any consideration of the condition of the colored people is important, the study of the Negro domestic is equally important in any careful consideration of the domestic service problem. It will be noticed that the percent for the middle section of states show only 10.67% of the domestic service performed by colored people. The large urban populations of the New York cities doubtless reduce this below what it would be if only Pennsylvania and New Jersey were considered, as city servants are mostly drawn from our foreign white population. But if the rate be accepted as true for the city of Philadelphia, though it is doubtless much too low for a city which has the largest colored population of any city in the United States except New Orleans and Washington, if it be accepted for Philadelphia, where 4% of the population is colored, we shall find that the Negro domestics run ahead of their ticket, here also in this matter of household service. The probable reason for this disproportion is not far to seek when we remember the unpopularity of domestic service which keeps whites out, and reflect that the colored prejudice which is known to operate against the Negro in nearly all departments of labor, excepting drudgery, actually works in its favor in the matter of domestic service, where the competence of Negro waiters and the superior skill of Negro cooks is generally admitted. Hence Negro labor, following the line of least resistance, flows in large streams into the channel of domestic service. End of section 2. Section 3 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sources of the supply and methods of hiring. The question next arises as to the chief sources of Philadelphia's large supply of colored service. Are these people Southern Negroes or Philadelphia-born? The quality of service rendered and the standard of excellence may depend in some degree upon circumstances of birth and training. Hence, the facts in regard to nativity are worth considering. These facts show clearly that the greater part of Philadelphia's colored domestic service is supplied from Maryland and Virginia, particularly from the latter state. It will be noticed that less than one-fifth of it, 18.5%, is supplied from Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania, while very nearly one-half, 48.4%, comes from the two states of Maryland and Virginia. Some interesting indications in regard to nativity and quality of service as measured by length of service with the same employer are interesting. Methods of hiring. Philadelphia is as much at the mercy of employment bureaus and the frequently untrustworthy recommendations of previous employers as are other large cities. Yet these and the method of advertising are the only ways open to the employer for accomplishing what has been called the inevitable annual change of employees. The colored people in domestic service seldom seek employment through the Philadelphia intelligence offices or by applying in answer to advertisement, unless it is particularly stated that colored help is acceptable or preferred. They generally offer the recommendations of former employers, though many of them, seldom the best ones, offer their services from door to door and are employed upon the recommendation of personal appearance and general bearing. The colored man's avoidance of the employment bureau is largely due to the fact that extortionate fees are usually charged him. He patronizes a few bureaus kept by colored people whom he trusts, and his unwillingness to answer advertisements needs no explanation but the remark already offered. Personnel of colored domestic service. In regard to the personnel of domestic service, the facts in Philadelphia correspond with those for all employees the world over. Negro domestic servants are for the most part women rather than men, and young rather than middle-aged or old people. An examination will show that only about 30 in 100 of Philadelphia's colored domestics are men, while a study of the census figures of 1890 shows only 16 men in 100 in domestic service the country over. And the disproportion in English household service is even greater, there being only 7 men in 100 London servants. A comparison shows very clearly that domestic work, which has long been considered as women's work, is still being done largely by women. A comparison shows that taking the country over, where the domestic service is represented largely by Irish, German, English, Swedish, and Norwegian elements, as well as Negroes, the proportion of men servants falls to only about one-half that of colored men servants in Philadelphia. This again is probably to be accounted for by the fact that so many avenues of employment which are closed to colored men are open to men among the white foreign element, which makes up the greater part of American service. In our shops and markets and in our building trades, on our trolley cars and our delivery wagons, we see Irish and German and Swedish men, but no Negroes. The result upon domestic service of this closing of so many doors to the colored man is twofold. Many of them, being unable to better themselves financially by leaving service for other employments, remain in household work much longer than they otherwise would do, and when they marry, many of them turn waiter, because household service is one of the best paid employments open to the blacks. Thus, colored men servants tend to remain in service longer than whites do, and the frequent addition to their ranks of married colored men also tends to increase the ratio of men servants among Negro domestics, as well as to raise the average age. Next to the small number of men in domestic service and the fact that a greater proportion of colored than of white men are domestics, a study of the personnel of domestic service reveals peculiarities concerning the age of servants. Nearly all household servants are comparatively young. This has been found to be true everywhere where records have been made, and more especially among whites than among blacks. The colored people in service are older on the average than the whites, as would be expected from facts just given. Nearly one-half of all the colored domestics in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, both men and women, are included in the age period between 21 and 30 years. The average age among them is 31.9 years for the men and 29.6 for the women, the combined average for both sexes being 30.3 years. This shows that Philadelphia's colored domestics are comparatively young people, but an examination of the age of London servants shows also 30.5 years as the average age of the men and 28.2 years as the average age of the women in service there. While the United States census of 1890 shows men servants the country over to average 29.1 years, the women average only 26.8 years. In America, the excess of young men in service begins at 15, lasting till nearly the age of 39, after which the proportion of men in service is less than that of men otherwise occupied. In the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, the greatest excess of youth in service is at about 23 to 25 years, but seems to show that in Negro wage earning in cities, the disproportionately large number of men in domestic service holds good for every age except the period which marks a man's greatest physical strength, the period between 30 and 40 years. The excess of colored men of that age in other occupations is no doubt due to the large number of colored men of great physical strength who act as stevedores, porters, etc., between the ages of 30 and 40. The sudden bend at 35 in the domestic service line is due to the fact that the last age period recorded was 41 years and over, and therefore includes a few old servants about 60. If each decade had been recorded, the curve would be more gradual, perhaps crossing the other between 40 and 45. The excess of 67 points on the 45-year line is almost equal to the excess at 25 years, and is therefore probably in need of modification, though there is little doubt of its indicating a real condition of Negro labor in cities. The fact that the highest point of excess of youth in these statistics is reached at 23 to 25 years is significant and suggests the query why it is that domestic service so clearly attracts the young of both sexes and of all races. It is safe to say that one of the most prominent determining causes is necessity for immediate income. Many young men and women are obliged by circumstances to undertake some form of work which, while requiring no capital and no particular course of training, still yields an immediate return, which is certain to provide them at least their board and lodging, with a small amount for living expenses. This is the chief reason why the first employment of young men and women just beginning to support themselves is so often going out to service. End of section 3. Section 4 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Grades of service and wages. In his study of household service in the 8th volume of Life and Labor of the People, Mr. Charles Booth distinguishes 3 grades or divisions among women in domestic service. The lowest group is made up of those employed in the roughest single-handed places. The next group is made up of those in single-handed places, but of a better class, while the third group includes those employed in many middle-class homes and in the large establishments of the wealthy, it being scarcely possible to make any practical division between these 2 classes of servants. Each group merges imperceptibly into the next above it, so that it is practically impossible to separate them in statistical enumeration. If another grade be supplied between the second and third given here, a grade found in well-to-do Philadelphia families, where 2 women servants are employed, this grading of London service applies very fairly to the condition of colored service in Philadelphia. A considerable number of families in Philadelphia employ but 1 woman servant, and hire no extra help to do laundry work, house cleaning, or outside work. The 1 woman does the cooking, washing, ironing, and drags up all the ashes, tends furnace, cleans the front, and does every single thing, as 1 woman put her own case. A second sort of household has only 1 domestic, but also hires extra service for laundry work, etc. Then follows the large number of houses where 2 women servants are kept, cook and second girl, sometimes with and sometimes without the weekly extra service. And finally the establishments with many domestics, each having his or her own special duties. The only classification of household servants which is at all practicable in this inquiry is that into sub-occupations or specialized kinds of work resulting from division of labor within domestic service. Such a classification of colored domestic service in Philadelphia shows 7 subdivisions of the work engaging the labor of men servants, while there are no fewer than 12 in which women are employed. For the males, such positions as errand boy, butler, coachman, waiter, cook, valet, general work. For the female, belle and errand girls, child's nurse, chambermaid, waitress, lady's maid, laundress, cook, chambermaid, and janitress, general housework. Work required of various sub-occupations. The work usually assigned to each of these subclasses is known in a general way by everyone. In one of the appendices to her book on domestic service, Miss Salmon publishes a circular letter from one of the committees of the Philadelphia Civic Club to the members of the club, submitting standards of work and wages for the various classes of sub-occupations among domestic servants. A single paragraph may be quoted which gives the duties of one sub-occupation minutely and accurately, though all sorts of cross-classifications occur in practice, the waitress often being also chambermaid or laundress. Waitresses at $3 or $3.50 per week must understand care of dining room, of silver, glass, and china, care and attention and waiting on table, care of parlor and halls, and answering the doorbell properly. The requirements for cooks, laundresses, chambermaids, nurses, etc., are given with equal accuracy of detail, but this is so generally understood that it is not necessary to dwell on the point here. The term janitress may need a word of explanation. This was what the hall servant and generally useful domestic at a large private boarding school called herself, and there were several others who seemed best classed with her. The duties of the butler in many cases extend to those of steward, and he is often to a large degree responsible for the selection and purchase of the food materials used in his particular establishment. The colored butler, thus honorably commissioned, generally styles himself butler and steward, though he has not, in any case, thus far personally encountered the responsibility of engaging and paying the other servants, as is the case with the English steward. The Philadelphia use of the word is evidently a modification of the English term and bears a quite different significance. The wages paid for these services vary in accordance with many modifying influences, as will be shown. Domestic service, however, is generally acknowledged to be well paid as compared with other occupations which are open to women. A cook receiving $4.50 a week, the average pay in Boston, can save as much in a year as the average teacher in American public schools, as is shown by a comparison of the average teacher's salary based on 6,512 records, and the statement is made on the authority of cashiers of banks in factory towns that domestics as a class save more than do factory hands. The range of wages paid to men in the various subdivisions of colored domestic service, and also the average wage in each class of service. For example, a butler may make $8.24 a week, as opposed to a bellboy who would make $2.61 a week. The figures here given, of course, represent the weekly pay for the services classified, but such sums as $1 as the weekly pay for the service of a cook, or $2 as that of a waiter, should be recognized as unusual and as recording facts which are far from typical, which represent the extreme of underpay offered but only under extraordinary circumstances, probably to a young and inexperienced boy, to an aged or otherwise inefficient cook. The average wages for colored women servants in Philadelphia range from errand girls, $2 weekly, to cook and laundress, $4 weekly, and other roles in the household, such as laundress, waitress, chambermaid, general work. These two tables show that in domestic service, as in every other department of the economic world, it is the office of skill or of trust which is the best paid. The offices of skill and trust among the men are those of butler and valet, or trusted personal attendant. Frequently the coachman is also butler. Comparison of the average pay of butlers with that of waiters, or general work of utility men, as they are called, shows very clearly the higher pay for skilled work. Men cooks' wages are here seen to be low in comparison with the butlers or coachmen's. This for several reasons. First, because in so small a number as were encountered, one man receiving only $1 brings down the average appreciably. Further, because in the wealthiest establishments almost no men cooks were encountered. The majority of men cooks reporting were employed in boarding houses, where presumably the pay was not allowed for on a lavish scale. But finally and chiefly, wages of men cooks are lower because a man servant who is a cook practically competes with the woman cook. The services of an excellent woman can be gotten for $4.50 or $5, while no woman can take the place of a butler or coachman. Hence butlers' wages are not affected by woman's competition. Doubtless the same tendency operates to lower the wages of waiters, now that such capable waitresses can be obtained. The same tendency is noticeable in England, where Mr. Booth says the butler is giving place to the neat parlour-maid. The table showing women's wages, the skilled specialists are cooks and laundresses, while the office of trust is held by the janitress, and these are seen to head the list in the matter of pay, being the only women domestics who receive on the average more than $4. The Boston Employment Bureau publishes a list showing the same thing. The average wages of cooks in Boston is given as $4.45, while chambermaids receive $3.86, waitresses $3.76, second girls $3.34, and general servants $3.16. The factotum, who does everything from cooking to furnace work and house cleaning, is evidently not considered a skilled hand nor paid as such. Secondly, these tables also show clearly a very large difference between the pay of men and of women in domestic service, the men receiving on the average close upon 100% more than the women. Miss Salmon averages showing the wages of men and of women domestics throughout the country are $167.96 yearly for women and $373.36 yearly for men. The difference here is more than 100%. These figures, therefore, emphasize this difference between men's pay and women's pay, showing that men servants are generally paid more than double the wages which women accept. Are wages in domestic service affected by race or color? How do theory and practice agree in this matter of wages? How nearly does the wage which ought to be paid agree with the actual average pay of domestics? A comparison of the figures with the standard of wages suggested by the ladies of the Philadelphia Civic Club in the letter already quoted is interesting as showing the close agreement between pay, which the best intelligence of the city believes to be just, and the actual average wages of Philadelphia domestics. This agreement points to the probability that among women, in domestic service at least, there is no difference between white pay and black pay, however much of it there may be in other departments of work in Philadelphia, for the Civic Club estimate is given for the whole field of service, white as well as black. Among men servants, however, there probably is a variation in wages determined largely by color. This first became evident on Rittenhouse Square, where the colored butlers encountered were receiving on the average $36.90 monthly, a slightly better wage than that of the Seventh Ward employees doing the same work, while the white butlers, according to the statement of one of their number, generally get $40 to $45 a month in the houses that keep one man. Where there are two men, two white men, the first may get $50 and the second $45, but there are not many houses that pay $50. The variation in pay of colored men and white butlers is probably partly due then to the fact already stated that there are relatively fewer white than colored men in service, thus giving different ratios of supply and demand for white and colored men servants. But the matter of fashion counts much. It doubtless has more influence in determining the pay of an employee who is as much in evidence as is the butler or coachman than it has in fixing the pay of an invisible employee, like the cook. The question of personal appearance and fashion holds also as between different grades of white employees, as will be seen from Mr. Booth's statements that in London a second footman of 5 feet 6 inches would command £20 to £22, while one of 5 feet 10 inches or 6 feet would not take under £20 or £30. Again, a short first footman could not expect more than £30, while a tall man would command £32 to £40. The same principle operating in Philadelphia often obliges colored men, like short footmen in London, to take what they can get. There is a relatively smaller demand for them for these two reasons, and so their pay varies from white men's pay, while among the women those cooks and maids who are the most skillful are in greatest demand, so that color makes less difference in the women's wages. Does imported service affect wages of colored domestic servants in Philadelphia? There can be little doubt that in household service, where hardly anything else could have affected their secure hold on at least this one branch of employment, fashion has militated against the colored people of Philadelphia. A Spruce Street colored butler said, "What are you going to do when you're shut out of your work? I don't know no other country. I was born here. The colored are shut out more than when I come to Philadelphia in '65. The foreigners shut us out of even our ordinary work we've always done in service. I don't know why, because the colored people are just as good help as they ever was. And the worst is it throws them into the slums when they can't get their work. I've been praying the Lord to help our people, etc." A white butler in Rittenhouse Square sums up the situation from what might be called the impersonal point of view. You see, they, the employers, go to Europe and bring home Englishmen, and that knocks out the Negro. Many colored women, natives, say that it is harder now than formerly to get good places because there are so many more white girls, foreigners, seeking household work. It is difficult to reduce to figures information on this point, but the following enumeration, which shows the distribution of colored service with reference to the fashionable quarter, seems to confirm the opinions of the butlers quoted, or at least to indicate that the people who employ the greatest number of servants employ fewer colored people than are to be found in plainer establishments. On Spruce Street, 58% domestics, or 35% of all colored domestic servants on Spruce Street. On Pine Street, 71% domestics, or 42% of all colored domestic servants on Pine Street. The smaller number of colored domestics employed in the fashionable section is noticeable both on Pine and Spruce Streets, the number to the east of Broad on Spruce being very nearly double that in the more fashionable region to the west. The greater divergence of the ratios east and west is where we should expect it in accordance with the butler's theory. That is on Spruce Street, the more fashionable street. On the whole, it seems probable that the fashion of importing English and French service has an appreciable effect in the direction of complicating Philadelphia's Negro problem. Importation, from the butler's point of view, is easily explained. The willingness of English butlers to come to America is doubtless largely, indeed almost wholly, due to the fact that their absolute money wages are so much higher here than in England. Few of them are political economists enough to realize that $600 in America may be worth only half that sum in England. So glittering an offer as that of double his present salary is eagerly accepted by the majority of Englishmen of a certain grade of intelligence, and this has quite definite results upon the domestic service of our large cities in America. The annual money wages of domestic servants in London are contrasted with the general yearly average wages of men and women's work in 37 of our states, and also with the wages of colored domestic servants in Philadelphia. The comparison here offered shows that in the most of the sub-occupations of domestic service, the actual sums paid are twice as large in America as in London. The range of wages in England, as given by Mr. Booth, also strengthens the belief that American wages must sound very large to English ears. The actual wages earned, says Mr. Booth, begin as low as 1 shilling a week, this amount being received in 3 cases out of a total of 1,692 servants, while 42 more were paid less than £5 per annum. At the other end of the scale, we find 3 servants, all over 30 years old, receiving from £26 to £36 a year, 3 more receiving £20 and £39, others receiving from £15 to £20. To an American, this sounds far from lavish, although it is, of course, impossible to know how much this money is worth until we know the cost of staple articles in London. Still, to a servant who has been receiving even £36 a year, $180, our highest women's wage, $520 yearly, would doubtless present remarkable attractions. Do board and lodging enter into or affect wages? A comparison of the items shows a very large difference between the pay of American men servants and American women servants. This seems hardly to be accounted for by the fact that a much larger percent of women in domestic service than of men receive board and lodging in addition to wages. Miss Salmon's investigation estimates that only 60% of the men servants receive board and lodging, while 98% of the women do. In the Philadelphia investigation, the facts upon this point seem to indicate that the amount of wages is only slightly affected, if at all, by the question of board and lodging. When these are given in addition to wages, they apparently do not stand in the mind of either employer or domestic as part payment for service. A comparison of the pay of women cooks who lodge at their place of work with that of women cooks who lodge at home will illustrate this. The average pay of those who lodge at their place of work and therefore receive board and lodging in addition to wages is $4.13, as contrasted with $3.95 received by those who go home at night. Here the difference will be seen to be in the opposite direction from what we should expect if board and lodging are reckoned as part of the wages of cooks. The same facts hold good for the other sub-occupations among colored domestic servants in the ward, which would seem to indicate that in Philadelphia at least board and lodging are customarily given, or not according as it suits the convenience or the preference of mistress or maid, but are not, except rarely, considered a part of the wages paid for service. Many employers doubtless believe that the service rendered by girls who lodge in their place of work is better, and they may perhaps consider the board and lodging given as added pay for better quality of service. Be this as it may, the actual money wages do not appear to be affected by it in Philadelphia, where, as will be seen by the following information, only 50% of the colored women in service and only 24% of the colored men lodge at their employers' establishments. To the thoughtful and thrifty colored domestic, this ought to suggest an easy way of saving a good bit for the old folks at home, if they can only see it that way, for they reduce the home expenses, both for meals and for rent in many cases, by lodging at place of work, while they themselves receive the same money wages, and very likely higher ones, whether their board and lodging comes out of their employer or is drawn from their own home circle. The majority of the single colored girls in service board and lodge in their employers' establishments, only 38.7% of them going home at night, while most of the married women in service, as is natural, do go home from work, only 27.5% of them lodging in the employer's house. Of the men reporting in regard to lodging place, 29% of the single men sleep at their places of work, while 71% having lodgings elsewhere. Of the married men, only 17.6% lodge at the place of work, while 82.4% lodge at home. End of section 4. Section 5 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Savings and Expenditure. The question of the savings of 7th Ward domestics would naturally be discussed here. We have seen the facts. They are based upon the records of those who have been personally interviewed. The societies referred to are either sick benefit, death benefit, or insurance societies, which are all very popular with the colored people. Their tendency to use this method of saving rather than to deposit in the bank is shown in many ways. They frequently express their distrust of banks and banking. One girl sums up her philosophy by saying, "I save in my pocket. I'm a very poor spender, but I bank a little too, only the banks are so shaky. I'm afraid of them." A friend of mine lost $600 in the Keystone, and I lost $100 and came near putting in $50 just the day before the bank broke. Yes, I'm afraid of banks. A waiter working on Spruce near Broad says, "I've quit banking. I lost $300 in the Keystone." This distrust of banks is traced by excellently qualified judges as far back as the Freedmen's Bank trouble, and it seems probable that the first wave of distrust has been followed by a second one, and that to the Philadelphia colored people the failure of the Keystone stands for the same thing nearer home. We also see that the proportion of colored domestics who are saving, and who therefore not only are not a burden to the community, but are adding something to the sum total of its power. It shows also the methods of saving employed. It will be noticed that the men do more banking in proportion than what the women do, and less saving at home, or by means of the benefit societies. 3 men use the bank where 1 woman does, while 3 women save at home to 1 man who does. It is also noticeable that the percentage of those who do not save at all are about equal in both of the sexes. In contrast with this 15%, which saves nothing, may be mentioned a few cases which seem particularly noteworthy as examples of unusual thrift. One, the case of a young chore man, 20 years old, who said no, he wasn't saving anything to speak of, and it would have passed at that had not his employer said, "Why, Henry, you know you bring me $2 every month to save for you." And it came out that from the $14 he earned monthly, he was regularly sending $5 each month to his aged mother and saving $2. The month before his report was taken, he had sent $10 to his mother because she had had a destructive fire at home and needed new articles. To the case of a man cook, 31 years old, who has been in his present situation over 7 years and earns $8 weekly. From this amount he has supported his family and built a home which he now owns. He also has a good bank account, which he says his wife doesn't know about. He's going to surprise her with it when he gets a good bit, or if she dies, she will have something to keep her. This man also has membership in 2 benefit societies. 3. The case of a young woman, 29 years of age, who receives $4 a week for cooking. She sends $10 a month to her mother, who is a consumptive invalid, and also puts by $2 every month. 4. A chambermaid, a widow, 53 years old, who says, I've got a little home in Virginia I bought and paid for myself. She earns $3 a week. She also has a bank account and belongs to a sick benefit society. 5. The case of a young woman of 22 years who banks half she earns every week. She earns $3.50 weekly and saves $91 a year from her total yearly earnings, $182. 6. The case of a butler earning $35 a month who owns 5 lots in Richmond, 2 more in New Jersey, and 1 in Essington. 7. Another butler, 40 years old, who has been 23 years in the same family. He is paid $40 a month. He owns a Maryland stock farm, which his uncle manages for him, several lots of land in South Philadelphia, has a term policy on which he pays $93 yearly, and has membership in a sick benefit which insures him $10 a week in case of illness. Perhaps the most popular way of saving among the colored servants of Philadelphia is now by means of the society. Of all those reporting on savings, 48.4% of the men and 52.7% of the women are saving in these societies. Whether this percent of patronage of societies by domestic servants is greater or less than that for the whole community, very nearly 2/3 of all the women who save at all do so through one or more societies, while the greater part of the other 1/3 do their saving at home, in their pockets. These societies, when they are bona fide insurance companies, often furnish fair investments to their contributors. A policy drawing a fee of $1.30 monthly when paid up entitles its holder to $10 a week in case of sickness. A policy drawing 80 cents a month entitles its holder to $5 a week sick benefit. These represent the sick benefit rates paid by 2 of the best and most reliable societies. The great value of such companies to such individuals as are subject to frequent illness and have no home for a refuge is clear at a glance. But it often happens that colored people who have iron constitutions will go into these societies and contribute year after year, reaping no benefit because they are never ill, and loath to stop paying their fees and begin to deposit in the bank for fear they should be ill. The fact that this sort of membership in sick benefits is a very bad investment was pointed out to a certain waiter on Pine Street who had paid $30 a year for 10 years into his 2 societies, but had never drawn a cent from either because he had never been sick. The fact that had he banked his money he would have had now in hand the sum of $300 could not be denied, but this certainty was not sufficient to stifle the feeling that if he dropped the societies he would lose all he had put in, and the question arising, suppose I should be sick, which was not to be satisfactorily answered by statements of probabilities. The same thing grown to greater proportions is seen in the case of one quite aged butler who for 16 years has held policies in 7 societies and has never drawn except when his wife died. Many instances might be cited of domestics who have belonged to 2 or more societies for 6 years or more and have never drawn, though their policies were paid up. Several instances were encountered of domestics who were saving in societies and also in the bank, and who, when they were sick, drew all their money out of the bank, and never thought of the society, and so did not draw at all, but exhausted their bank accounts, and were then presumably helped by friends. One woman who had been insured in one society for 17 years and also held a sick benefit exhausted her whole bank account and only drew on the society for 2 weeks, although she was ill some months, because she didn't think of it till she had spent all the money she had in the bank, all which goes to show how difficult it is for a people long unused to any financial responsibility to adjust their minds to it, and how easy a matter it is for unscrupulous persons or societies to take advantage of their simplicity. Assistance given by domestic servants in connection with wages and savings may be considered the matter of assistance to dependents. Many colored domestics in Philadelphia either wholly support or very materially help toward the support of parents or other members of the family, even in many cases taking entire care of more distant relatives outside the immediate home circle. The answers to questions of the schedule, who besides yourself is supported by your wages, were separated into 4 grades. 1, those who wholly supporting one or both parents. 2, those helping parents. 3, those wholly supporting others than parents. 4, those helping but not wholly supporting others than parents. In this matter, the men generally do less proportionately than the women. Of 187 men reporting on this point, 13, that is 7%, are of the first class, who furnish from their earnings the whole support of one or more parents. 40, or 21.4%, are of the second class and are helping one or both parents. 25, or 13.4%, are of the third class and are supporting some other member of the family, generally some younger brother or sister, while 16, or 8.6%, are of the fourth class and are helping, though not wholly supporting, some other member of the family. 8, or 4.3%, are doing more than one of these things. For example, one young fellow of 20 years who earns only $3 a week is responsible for the support of his father's entire family, 7 in number, as the father drinks and cannot be depended upon. One waiter, 28 years old, receives $20 a month and is helping his own father and mother, and both his wife's parents also. His wife, too, is earning, so what it practically amounts to is that the 2 young people are between them taking care of the 4 old people. The facts gathered in the 7th Ward show 50.3% of the men in domestic service are contributing toward the support of parents or others, while 49.7% have no one but themselves to look out for. These facts and similar ones for colored women domestics are here tabulated. 187 men in all reported on this subject and 420 women. What is the actual condition in regard to responsibilities assumed for the help or support of parents and others? It is difficult to estimate at a moment's notice what one spends or gives for any one object. To determine with any degree of accuracy the amount one spends in a year for clothing is not always an easy thing to do, so the answers given must involve a large amount of involuntary misstatement. Many who do help their parents and others report that they cannot estimate how much it takes. 15, however, who give no estimate as to proportion of wages given, say very plainly that it takes all I make, or it takes everything I make to clothe me. One married man of 40 is supporting his sister's little girl, who he says is like an adopted child to us. Her father and mother are living, but they have 3 or 4 besides her to support. This man earns $30 a month, on which he supports his own family and his sister's little girl, and is also saving in the bank, and has a $1 fee in a sick benefit society. One young waiter man, earning $25 a month, is making a home for his mother and helping 3 sisters besides, but none of these cases appear, since none of them could give any kind of an estimate of the proportion of earnings given. That considerable was given in each of these cases, however, is obvious, and many similar instances might be cited. It is almost invariably true of bellboys and errand boys and girls that they take their entire earnings home to their parents to swell the general store. One young bellboy said that he took all he earned home to his mother, except 25 cents he kept himself, and she saved that for him. Summary: a large part of the earnings of the colored domestics of the ward are thus seen to go towards the support of parents and dependents. This generosity towards their own will be attested, it is believed, by every one who has had any considerable knowledge of the colored people. When one remembers that the same thing is noticeably true of the Jews, the thought naturally occurs that it is perhaps an instinct of self-preservation which reveals itself among oppressed races. Again, that with a majority of Negroes, some part of their earnings are steadily put by for a nest egg, to use one of their own quaint expressions, will doubtless be similarly attested. There is, of course, much extravagance among Negroes. Much is doubtless spent for amusement, much certainly goes for finery. These outlays are comparatively large with some among the colored domestics of Philadelphia, although the facts which came to the knowledge of the investigator during these 9 months in Philadelphia seem to indicate that, speaking broadly, the colored domestics of the city are a thrifty class of people. End of section 5. Section 6 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Amusements and Recreations. There can be little doubt that the monotony of the life of a domestic employee is one of the chief obstacles in the way of many competent workers who, but for this, might enter service as a permanent employment. Although household work is less arduous than many other forms of manual labor, yet it is true of it more than of almost any other occupation that it demands practically the whole of the worker's time. Nearly all of the restaurant waiters interviewed have only 2 hours at a time, and it will readily be understood that with their leisure so broken they find it difficult to employ it to any very great advantage, either in the direction of study or of recreation. The liberty of the private waiter, except on his day out, is even less than that of the hotel waiter. Household work is a ceaseless round, which, like woman's work, is never done, and the private domestic, even when given considerable liberty and free time, while within the household, must always hold himself in readiness to answer any call at a moment's notice. All this is a very serious objection in the minds of most young people who, as has been seen, constitute the greater part of domestic service everywhere. Without doubt it deters many whites as well as blacks, and many rural as well as urban people from entering household service. Indeed, it is probable that it determines in a very considerable degree the personnel of domestic service in England as well as throughout the United States, and somewhat modifies its character in the matter of permanence, as many English girls prefer factory work, and many girls in our cotton-growing and grape-raising regions, as well as in our factory towns, prefer field and factory work when it is to be had, and only fall back into the ranks of domestic service when the season is past or factory work slack. Of the restlessness of household servants in England, Mr. Booth says, many of this class, the middle grade, only go to service when factory work is slack. They almost universally stipulate for 1 whole day's holiday in every month. Indeed, with most of them, this seems to be the one thing which makes the servant's life worth living. The dullness and monotony of a domestic servant's life seems to be the most generally pressing question. The demand is for more Sundays and evenings out and a monthly holiday. Careful mistresses assert that they find that even quite young girls fresh from the country chafe under any restriction as to the manner in which they shall spend their leisure, or as to being out late alone. The same tendencies are noticeable throughout American domestic service, both with native whites, foreign whites, and colored domestics. This dissatisfaction is shown by the restless attempts of domestics to enter other occupations. Among American domestic employees, the country over 28% are found to have been engaged in other occupations such as hop picking, grape and cotton picking, and factory work. That these people are now employed in domestic work, Miss Salmon believes, means not so much a preference for service as that it is a sort of dernier ressort to be taken up only when no better paid or more popular work offers. For the other kinds of work named, the employees get wages so high as to enable them to live for a considerable time in idleness, hence its popularity among young people in many places. Among the colored people in the city of Philadelphia, 524 domestics report in regard to other occupations. Of this number, 91 or 17.4% have done or attempted to get the opportunity to do other work than domestic service, and it is noticeable that the employment which has occupied this 17.4% of colored domestics has been very different in character from the field and factory work attracting young domestics in general. Among colored city domestics, the work done by the women before entering service has very generally been dressmaking, typewriting, or teaching, while the men have worked as porters or drug clerks, or have practiced trades or even professions. One man was encountered who had graduated from Hampton and from a law school as well, while several stone cutters, brick masons, and carpenters were found who had drifted or been forced into the ranks of domestic service. The chief difference between the case of these Negro domestics in the city and the case of the grape pickers and factory hands, both in England and America, who have tried to leave service for other work, is indicated by the widely different character of the work sought in each case. The grape and cotton pickers and the factory hands leave service only temporarily, lured by the high wages and the liveliness of the work, fully expecting all the time to return to service when the harvesting is over and their wages spent, while the colored city employees who attempt to get other work wish to leave domestic service permanently. They wish to do this partly because they consider that service savors of slavery and that they are degraded by it, and being ambitious of achieving respectability, they attempt to better their social standing by becoming teachers or dressmakers, partly also because they hope for higher wages from teaching and other work than they receive as domestics. The difference between the proportion of servants the country over who have done other work and the proportion of colored domestics in Philadelphia who have done or attempted to do other work is a large one. 28% of general domestic service, as contrasted with 17.4% of colored domestic service, shows a difference which is almost in the ratio of 5 to 3. And also it must be remembered that this accentuates the difference still further, that the colored servants who have tried to get other work and failed have also been counted, since the attempt showed their restlessness in service and their desire to leave it. There must be some reason for this apparent willingness to remain in service on the part of the colored people. In answer to the scheduled question, "Have you ever tried to do other work?" a large number of domestics replied, "I never go any place I'm not sure of. I won't give them a chance to refuse me." One girl who had taught for 4 years and who thinks she lost her place at the end of that time from prejudice on the part of the school committee says, without the slightest apparent touch of resentment, "The reason I don't try to teach is because I know I'd have trouble and I can save as much this way." Another ex-teacher has now been a chambermaid for several years for the same reason. One Philadelphia carpenter and builder says, "We have 5 granddaughters, my son's children, from 23 years old to 14, and what can we do with them? They can't get teachers' places, though they are good students. Dressmaking is about played out. Service, they don't want to do that. Typewriting is about the only hope, and the oldest one was refused that the other day." One man, now a waiter, was formerly a stock clerk for the Eureka Silk Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, and held his place there for 7 years. At the end of that time he applied by letter for a similar position in Philadelphia and was told to come along. Everything was satisfactory, his record was good, and they would try him. When he appeared in person, they inquired, "Are you Mr. Blank?" "Well, we have another applicant on file who is coming around today. If we don't decide on him, we'll let you know. He left his address and has not heard from the firm since. He says waiting is all we can get to do, and lots will refuse us that. No man as dark as I am could get work at one of the large apartment houses. They want a bright skin. It is the same in many hotels and families too." Another man states that when he applied for office work, the clerk to whom he addressed his remarks looked at him and did not answer him at all. While yet another, a fine-looking young man of the type called a brown skin, said he had been refused clerk's work with insults which it would be impossible for him to repeat before a lady, words he would not soil his lips with. Fortunately, however, this is becoming less common. When colored domestics are refused, it appears to be generally with the simple statement that white help is preferred. It should be said here that among those who said that they had never attempted anything except domestic employment, 52 or about 10% have even been refused domestic work when applying for it. Some of these were inclined to charge the refusal to race prejudice. Some attribute it to the fact that unintelligent employers class all colored people together, or to put it in their own words, if the mistresses has bad luck with one colored girl, they won't never have another. They think all colored is alike. Still others think it is not a race question at all, but merely one of supply and demand. As one man put it, there isn't work enough or places enough to go round. That's it. There are many well-authenticated cases also of light-colored people who have retained their places from 2 to 15 years under the impression on the part of the employer that they were white people, but on the discovery of the slight tincture of African blood, although it could not be detected, and although the work had been entirely satisfactory, their situations were immediately forfeited. Such instances might be multiplied indefinitely, as they were encountered upon every hand. In consideration of all this, it appears highly probable that the Negroes are deterred in many cases from attempting to obtain other work from unwillingness to run the risk of insult or failure. The moral certainty of having trouble is probably sufficient to account for the comparatively low percentage of colored domestics who have attempted to leave service, while the well-known fact that so many industries are closed against the race would account in large measure for the scarcity of those who have actually been engaged in other employments. These facts are sufficient to explain the 10.6% difference in the two percentages compared. Judging by the character of the work sought by the domestics who have left or attempted to leave service, it seems fair to conclude that while the monotony of service and the low pay, as compared with harvest wages, are the chief things that rural American servants have against it, probably the chief objection of colored city domestics against service is the social stigma which rightly or wrongly attaches to it. It savors to them of the degradation of their slavery days, while they believe that to be a teacher is to achieve immediate social position and become a respected member of the community. Colored city domestics seek other work, therefore, from the desire to escape social degradation first, from the desire for greater personal freedom next, and finally from the hope of higher remuneration. But while the social stigma is the city Negro's chief objection to domestic service, there can be no doubt that from his point of view this dullness of the life is one of its most serious drawbacks, the most serious probably with the exception of the one already named. That the monotony of service is as keenly felt by the colored people as by any other domestics may easily be inferred both from the well-known fact of the natural joyousness and gaiety of the Negro's disposition, and also from the fact that so large a proportion of them, as compared with other domestics, stipulate for the freedom of their evenings. It was found from schedules relating to 564 cases that 75.6% of all the Negro men servants interviewed and 49.3% of all the women servants go home from work. When this is contrasted with the percent of domestic servants the country over who go home from work, we find a remarkable divergence. In general service, 40% of the men and only 2% of the women lodge at home, that is to say, outside the establishment of the employer. This seems to show clearly the greater tendency of the colored domestic to escape from the solitary confinement to which our present system of household management condemns all the servants in single-handed places. It should be marked, however, that the percents relating to Philadelphia colored people here are based on less than 600 schedules, while those relating to general service are based upon over 2,500. Also, it is much oftener the case among colored domestics that they work in the same city in which their families and friends live, while many white women domestics have no home nearer than Ireland or Sweden, and so they naturally lodge at their working places, while the colored women as naturally lodge at home when it is possible to do so. Questions will arise as to the amount of leisure time usually granted to colored domestics and how this leisure is employed. It would be impossible to tabulate the statements returned in answer to the question, number of hours free each month, but it may be said in general that a very great number of different arrangements obtain even in this one ward of one city. The most of them include one afternoon each week, and the evening or the afternoon and evening of alternate Sundays. For the greater number of both men and women, domestics report this amount of leisure, while some are allowed only one afternoon in every third Sunday, or one afternoon in every fourth Sunday. Still a considerable number are given the usual afternoon of a weekday and every Sunday afternoon as well. Some have their afternoon and alternate Sundays, and one or more evenings, and a considerable number have this arrangement with the freedom of all their evenings, while still others have 2 afternoons weekly and alternate Sundays. The whole holiday every month, which is so dear to the English household servant, is not found in American domestic service. No Negro employee in the Philadelphia ward investigated reported such a whole holiday, however liberal might be the leisure granted in the shape of parts of different days. And Miss Salmon's treatment of the subject mentions no whole day of leisure for domestics, but states that in the case of more than 1,000 employees, at least one afternoon each week is given, while more than 400 employers give a part of Sunday. The question how their leisure is employed was answered by only 257 colored domestics, of whom 206 were women and only 51 were men. It will be seen from the tabulation of these returns that the Negro Church is very closely bound up with the problem of the recreations of the Negro people, and in this connection a word of explanation is necessary to acquaint the general reader with the status of the Negro Church. To quote from a well-known American scholar and writer who is an authority upon race questions, among most people the primitive sociological group was the family, or at least the clan. Not so among American Negroes. Such vestiges of primitive organization among the Negro slaves were destroyed by the slave ship. In this country, the first distinct voluntary organization of Negroes was the Negro Church. The Negro Church came before the Negro home. It antedates their social life in every respect. It stands today as the fullest, broadest expression of organized Negro life. We are so familiar with churches, and church work is so near to us that we have scarce time to review it in perspective and to realize that in origin and functions the Negro Church is a broader, deeper, and more comprehensive social organism than the churches of white Americans. The Negro Church is not simply an organism for the propagation of religion. It is the center of social, intellectual, and religious life of an organized group of individuals. It provides social intercourse. It provides amusements of various kinds. It serves as a newspaper and intelligence bureau. It supplants the theater. It directs the picnic and excursion. It furnishes the music. It introduces a stranger to the community. It serves as a lyceum, library, and lecture bureau. It is, in fine, the central organ of the organized life of the American Negro for amusement, relaxation, instruction, and religion. To maintain its preeminence, the Negro Church has been forced to compete with the dance hall, the theater, and the home as an amusement-giving agency. Aided by color proscription in public amusements, aided by the fact mentioned before that the church among us is older than the home, the church has been peculiarly successful, so that of the 10,000 Philadelphia Negroes whom I asked, "Where do you get your amusements?" fully 3/4 could only answer, "From the churches." This centralization of amusement about the church shows itself very conspicuously. Nearly 57% of the Negro men and nearly 66% of the Negro women in domestic service look to the churches and the church entertainments for all their recreations, except those engaged within the precincts of their own homes, such as home studies, music, and social visits. Indeed, the number who depend upon the Church in this matter should be even greater than these figures indicate, since it is true that many of those reporting that they spend their leisure at home resting, or at home sewing and clearing up, also in most cases report in answer to question 23 of the schedule the Church of which they are members, of whose regular services they regularly attend. Of the 17 men reporting that their leisure is spent in resting up, only 2 report that they attend no church, and of the 61 women thus classified, only 4 attend no church. If we count these at-home domestics, then where they really belong with the churchgoers, we shall have 93.2% of the women and 86.3% of the men among domestics who depend on the church for their lectures, libraries, music halls, festivals, etc., as well as for their religious instruction and uplift. This gives a combined average of 91.8% of all colored domestics whose usual entertainment and instruction is of this kind. A comparison of the percents of those whose leisure is chiefly devoted to study shows that 19.6% of the men are so classified to 14.1% of the women. Nearly a third of the women so classed are music students, and if these are counted out, we shall have only 9.7% of the women domestics devoting their leisure chiefly to study and reading. One young waiter, a West Indian, was devoting his spare time to the study of English, and meantime was taking his directions from his employer in French. Another waiter reported that he read the classics in his spare hours, and still another confessed to a fondness for the poets, but at the same time he offered a pleasing contrast to many of the poets he admired in having his collar and white tie and complete costume quite faultlessly neat and well ordered. The mistress of one household says, "Our waiter has the education of a gentleman," but on the other hand, one employer, whose judgments were evidently free from bias, says, "Our man may be a good lawyer, but he certainly is not a good waiter." This was, however, the only adverse criticism offered in regard to any of the domestics who were students and readers. It appears that educated domestics are generally no worse workers than others, if they are no better. In at least 2 cases it appeared that the educated domestic did better household work than others. These were a cook and maid whose employer said both her girls read a great deal, and apparently spent their time upon good literature. Her cook was then reading Hyperion, she said. The question naturally followed, "Is she a good cook?" "Yes, I've never had a more efficient girl," was the ready reply, "and I have employed both white and colored. These are 2 of the cleanest girls I have ever had in the house." Several of the women servants reported their leisure devoted chiefly to literaries, all of which, so far as the investigator was able to learn, were connected with the churches. These students and readers among domestic servants doubtless are the more ambitious ones, who are anxious to improve every opportunity with the hope of finally working their way out of service. This high percent of readers among colored domestics, 20% of the men and 10% of the women, ought not to be surprising, however, when we remember that 10% of these people have had some training higher than the common school, and might therefore be expected to have literary taste. In regard to the home-keeping domestics, if the first and last classes are combined, we find 41.2% of home-keeping women domestics who are either at home or at their churches during their leisure time. At the Pennsylvania hospital, the investigator was informed by one of the officials in charge that more late passes were given to the white than to the colored servants, and there are about equal numbers of each race employed. The church affiliation of colored domestic servants in Philadelphia may be given in this connection. Reports from 548 persons were received on this point, 400 women and 148 men. Nearly 95% are church affiliated. End of section 6. Section 7 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Length and quality of Negro domestic service. In regard to length of service, we have 284 reports from men employed in domestic service and 591 from women, 875 altogether. Of these, 213 are from men personally interviewed, and since this question was uniformly asked. These 213 reports will represent the service of the rank and file of men servants. The remaining 71 were recorded upon the family schedules and were obtained, therefore, from the statements of their parents or sisters, and since no question regarding length of service appears in the family schedule, this information was evidently volunteered. From this fact, it seems probable that the length of service in these 71 cases was put forward as being something unusual, as indeed it is, including as it does 7 records of 10 to 15 years' service with one family, 12 records of 16 to 20 years, and 10 records of over 20 years of service, one coachman having served 41 years in the same family. In view of the nature of this information has been kept separate from the other records and dealt with by itself in order to avoid misrepresentation of facts. The percentage of service men from Philadelphia is 18.4%, 28.2% from Virginia. Turning to consider the pay of these long service men, it is found that of these 71 men, 20 are coachmen, while 51 are private waiters. The range of wages is seen to approach close upon $9 a week. With these facts concerning service periods, nativity, and wages of long service men, it may be interesting to compare the same facts for the men of the rank and file. With the rank-and-file men, the service periods vary from a few days to 31 years, the average period being 4 years, 6 months, and some days, a considerable contrast with the 11 years and 5 months of the long service men. Maryland and Virginia are seen to be far in the lead in the matter of furnishing the domestic service of the 7th Ward of Philadelphia. Here, indeed, the Virginia record rises to a number almost twice as great as that furnished by both Philadelphia and Pennsylvania taken together. Although the percentage from the state here practically agrees with that of the long service men, the facts in regard to range of wages and average wages of coachmen and private waiters in the rank and file of service in the 7th Ward, long service men whose average coachman's wage is $10.74, while their average waiters' wages $8.10, and their general average wage is $8.84, nearly $9, would seem to point to the possibility that length of service may have some occult connection with length of pocketbook, and that the giving satisfaction may not be all on one side of the line in the domestic service question. Of course, it is true that a bad servant cannot command high wages. Also, it is impossible to transform a poor servant into a good one by paying him high wages. But on the other hand, it is true that good service cannot be obtained without paying good wages for it. Schedules giving service periods of colored women employed in the 7th Ward show 591 records, only 6 of which were volunteered as unusual, as in the case of the long service men. In view of the smallness of this number, these 6 schedules have not been dealt with separately, but the women who have served 5 years and over have been isolated, irrespective of the manner in which the information was obtained, and their statements separately treated, as in the case of the long service men. The long service women who have served 5 years and more show 178 records. The range of service periods is from 5 to 35 years, the average being 6 years and 8 months. The range of service periods of rank-and-file women varies from 1 day to 5 years, while their average service period is found to be 3 years and 6 months, only about one-half the service period of the long service women. Their nativity and that of the rank-and-file women record a greater proportion of long service women come from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, which is not the case, contrasting nativity of the men. By comparing the last 2 statistics, it will be seen that the wage varies less between long service and ordinary service women than in the case of the men. The ordinary cook's wage, $3.99, compares more favorably with $4.21, the long service cook's wage, than does $8.58, the ordinary coachman's wage, with $10.74, the wage of the long-service coachman, and the contrast throughout will be seen to be less pronounced in the women's than in the men's wages. But if the wage of ordinary service and long service varies less among the women than among the men, it must be remembered that the length of service varies less among the women than among the men. The average service periods of two classes of men servants are 4 years 6 months and 11 years 5 months, the one being 2½ times as great as the other, while the average service periods of the two classes of women are 3 years 6 months and 6 years 8 months, the one being not quite twice the other. Hence the narrower variations in wages of women as compared with those of men would corroborate the theory of the close connection of quality of service and consequent length of service with high wages, rather than weaken that theory. Also, it is true that in spite of the occasionally greater range in the wages paid to the rank and file, the average wages of the long-service domestics, both men and women, are uniformly greater than the average wages paid to the rank and file. Combining the average service periods of the long-service domestics with those of the rank and file gives us a combined average of 6 years and 1 month as the average service period of colored men servants, and 4 years and 5 months as the average service period of colored women servants in Philadelphia. Again, uniting these averages of servants of both sexes in Philadelphia gives the combined average service period for all colored domestics in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia. This combined average service period is 4.96 years, that is to say 5 years, lacking less than 1 month. It is based on 875 records. This offers a decided contrast with the average length of service of domestics the country over, which average service period, Miss Salmon states, is found to be less than 1 year and a half. This contrast in service periods may be made clear by noticing the length of service period of Negroes and of general domestic service in the United States given in terms of a common unit of length. These service periods will be seen to stand to each other in the ratio of about 3 to 10, and may have some connection with the relative numbers of white and Negro domestics. It may be that the Negro service period is 3 times as long as the average service period, because there are 3 times as many Negro servants proportionately, and therefore 3 times as many chances for capable servants to be found among them. Another possible explanation of the longer period of colored domestics may be their greater docility as servants. As one employer whose name is well known in Philadelphia circles has said of colored domestics, if you get a good class of colored people, they are the most faithful, honest, and biddable servants in the world. This docility, which is a recognized trait of the Negro character, has doubtless been developed by slavery, and it is not unlikely that it has been still further cultivated in these later days by their knowledge that losing their places in service may mean inability to get work of any kind for an indefinite period. However, if we may judge from the remarks of a certain colored waitress upon length of service, the Negroes feel that there is a point beyond which docility and a respectful bearing cease to be virtues. As she had held her own situation for 22 years, her remark may fairly be taken as unaffected by personal considerations. She said, "Yes, they say long service is good service, but sometimes you can't stay at places. Some of the ladies and gentlemen's not very pleasant." An employer on the same point says, "It isn't the servants any more than it is the mistresses who are responsible for the frequent changes of place." She thinks that it varies with the individual, not with the race. Many of the employers who discussed the subject with the investigator said that their experience was that colored servants were more respectful. 6 said this, less impertinent. 2, very anxious to please. 2, more agreeable and obliging and of nicer manners. 4. A third possible explanation of the longer period of service among colored domestics may be found in the fact frequently adduced by their employers that they are much more likely than white girls to become attached to the family, so they naturally stay longer in one place than others do. Another employer says when they become fond of you, they are very staunch friends, and yet another says of them, they are much more loyal and infinitely more affectionate than white servants. They have shown me absolute loyalty in service. This is significant as being the testimony of a Northern woman who had never seen a colored servant before she was married, and who employed them for the first time on coming to Philadelphia, and now after 16 years would never have anyone else. The question whether one state or one section furnishes better domestics than another state or section is interesting, and has its bearing on the point under discussion. It is possible that the Philadelphia colored people represent a higher grade socially and intellectually than the Negroes of the South, and so in searching for an explanation of the connection between length of service and quality of service, it may be suggestive and valuable here to compare the facts already tabulated in regard to nativity with the facts in regard to ordinary and extraordinary service, to see if any indication may be forthcoming as to the locality which furnishes the best quality of colored domestic service, whether Philadelphia and Pennsylvania or the South. Such a comparison may cast light on the moot question whether Philadelphians are more likely to be well served by Philadelphia colored people or by Southerners. The percent of Philadelphia colored people among long service and ordinary domestics as compared with the corresponding percent of Virginia-born colored domestics. Virginia has been chosen to represent the South because it is the Southern state furnishing the greatest number of domestic servants in the 7th Ward, and is perhaps the state coming most sharply into competition with the native colored domestics. The proportions of Pennsylvania and of Virginia service here shown are approximately represented by the fractions 19/35, 20/34, 26/27, and 18/25, where the numerator in each case stands for Philadelphia servants employed in the 7th Ward, and the denominator stands for Virginia servants. The values of these fractions will be seen to increase progressively, excepting the last, so that the greater values correspond with the longer service periods. The values of these fractions, then, when taken in connection with the increasing service periods, would seem to indicate that the greater the proportion of Philadelphia domestics as compared with the proportion of Virginia domestics, the more valuable is the service. That is to say, that Philadelphia-born colored people appear to render the more efficient service. It should be said that the fourth fraction in the above comparison, to be consistent with the theory offered, should be larger than the third, but it must be remembered that the fourth fraction is based upon only 71 records, and is therefore less likely to represent the facts accurately than the others, which are based on a much greater number of records. Such indications as the above approach nearer to accurate treatment of the question of quality of service, rendered than it is possible to get through quoting opinions of employers. The subject is hard to treat at all adequately, for the reason that all statements of degrees of excellence or of incompetency must be based on the shifting sands of opinion, and upon the opinions of many different people, having different traditions, different education and home influences, different degrees of insight, and different standards of excellence. Statements so conditioned must necessarily be relative and impossible to reckon up and number with any semblance of statistical precision. Still, the opinions of the employers of colored domestics in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, a large proportion of whom have employed both white and colored help, should have a certain interest and value, even though they are not reducible to figures. 55 employers in the 7th Ward stated their views in regard to the qualities of Negro domestics, and many varying opinions, both favorable and unfavorable, were expressed. The balance of testimony from these 55 employers, however, seems to be largely in favor of the colored people rather than the whites, both in regard to the service offered and in the attitude of the employee toward the employer. Only one employer stated that she preferred white to colored. She was employing colored help at that time only because she had not been able to secure satisfactory white girls. 20 employers say that they find colored domestics quite as neat as whites, while 2 find them not as neat, and 5 find them more so, much cleaner than the Irish, both in their work and in their persons. They keep their kitchen and their own room cleaner. 10 employers think they stay for as long or longer a service period, while 7 think they do not stay as long as the whites. 14 employers think they render as good service as whites, and 11 think their service better or a great deal better, while 1, although employing 3 colored servants, thinks the whites do better work and says she has colored servants because they look more like servants. She also thinks they drink more than the whites, an opinion which, so far as the present investigator can learn, she is unique in holding, since all the other employers who discussed the point held the opposite view. One gentleman, the business manager of one of the large first-class apartment hotels, which employs 30 dining-room men, names their freedom from intemperance as one of the chief reasons why he decidedly prefers colored help. They give more attention to their work, he says, are better waiters, and they drink less. They can be counted upon on payday the same as any other day, while white serving men are likely to go and drink up their pay and be useless for the rest of the day. The business manager of the Continental says the same thing, as do also all the hotels which employ colored service. A very few employers think colored domestics are lazy and neglect their work, while more than 4 times as many say that they are industrious and good workers, splendid workers, a great deal better workers, and decidedly better cooks than the whites. One employer says on this point, "No, I have not found them lazy, at least no more so than others. There are good ones and bad ones among both white and colored." Skill in cooking was mentioned by only 6 employers, all of whom think colored cooks superior to other servants in this respect. Further judgments are, they are excellent servants and have an intuitive knowledge of what you want. They do all the things white servants wait to be told to do. Several employers agree on these points, but one says they have to be told to do everything, but if you keep after them, you can get the things done. The testimonial of one cook upon the virtues of her madam will show this matter from the domestic point of view. This cook says, "My madam gives me the key, and she never comes down to see if I'm here in the morning. She knows I'll be here, and she never comes into the kitchen to see if meals are getting along, because she knows when 6:30 comes, she can trust her girls to have it ready right then." One mistress said, "Trust them," and I have found they always prove themselves worthy of trust. 18 employers concur in the view that they are trustworthy and do not disappoint confidence, while 3 think them unreliable and untrustworthy as compared with white servants. On this subject, one employer on Spruce Street said, "I think the colored people are much maligned in regard to honesty, cleanliness, and trustworthiness. My experience of them is that they are immaculate in every way, and they are perfectly honest, and indeed I can't say enough that is good about them." These sentiments were held by several other employers, one on Broad Street using almost the same words. "I think the colored people are very much maligned in this matter of honesty and trustworthiness. I have 2 colored men now who are as honest as the sun, and my cook, who also does all the marketing, is very industrious and careful, painstaking. She is a good, faithful creature, and very grateful." In regard to the question of the pilfering of food left from the table, the consensus of opinion is heavily against the colored people. There are only 3 employers who have anything to say in defense of them in this particular, and 6 against. Their defenders say, "After 10 years of experience with the colored people, I've never had a colored servant take anything, even food. The next, we lost more food, etc., from the treating in the kitchen, which the Irish indulge in, than we have ever missed from pilfering of colored servants." And a third, who employs both white and colored servants, says, "I know it is frequently said that the colored people take food home from the kitchen, but I have not found it so. On the other hand, it is said, they are good servants, but they will carry things off." While another says they take food, they don't mean to be dishonest, but they don't consider that stealing, and are perfectly honest about money. Another employer says, "Unquestionably, they are light-fingered about food and sweetmeats. Slavery has always clothed and fed them and taught them to help themselves. We think slavery is responsible for it." Another thinks they are like children in temptation. They can't resist sweetmeats, but never take things of value. The other 2 employers who spoke on this point say practically the same thing. They are honest. They take things to eat home, but they don't count that. "We never lose anything valuable." The other calls them thieves, but evidently means pilferers of food. In regard to their honesty, the balance is as strongly with them as in this question of purloining food, it is against them. 18 employers say they are honest, and not one states the opposite. 2 of these find them more honest than white servants. The 2 others already quoted say they are perfectly honest as the sun. Many remarks made by domestics themselves in the course of conversation might be quoted as casting light on the subject, but only 2 will be given here. One elderly colored man who had been a school janitor in the west end of the ward for 2 years, and was nearly 9 years in his former place, said, "Some people say if you put your hand in a man's pocket, you're stealing. They think that's the only way. But if you loaf 2 or 3 hours every day when your boss is paying you for working, I say you're stealing just the same, stealing his time. I say we only live one day at a time, and that one day we've got to do the same as if we'd just come to that place. In summer places I've seen them so triflin', fooling away their time, and merely because the proprietor don't see them." The same spirit was shown by a woman cook on Broad Street, who took pleasure in doing good work always for her lady, whose kindness she enlarged upon with a warmth that showed a strong affection. This woman said, "When my time comes to go home from here, it will be a pleasant thought that I have done all I can to help my kind employer." These 2 cases imply not only honesty in the overt act, but an entire honesty of purpose. Many similar cases might be cited. The question of the general bearing and manners of colored domestics was discussed by many of their employers. The general opinion of the employers is that they are more willing and obliging than white servants. As one employer says, "The Germans drink and the Irish order you out of the house, but the colored people are more respectful and anxious to please. They are more agreeable and obliging and have nicer manners." Says another employer, and adds, "When my sister was ill, the Irish maid I had at the time refused to carry up the breakfast tray because she said it was not her business to do nursing, and she wouldn't do it for $10. So the employer herself prepared and carried up the trays until the colored girl, who came soon after, volunteered her services with, 'Let me take up the breakfast tray, Mrs. W. You look ready to drop.' And since she came, Mrs. W. has never had a white girl in the house." That the colored people are more willing and obliging in manner is attested by 20 employers and denied by no one, while one employer, who is connected with the university and has had years of experience both with white and colored servants, says of the colored people, "Whether they are better or worse than the whites may depend upon what whites you have. We had white servants for 7 winters, and always employed the best Irish servants we could get, but they were so unsatisfactory that we gave them up and tried colored servants. Our experience of them is that they are infinitely cleaner than the white Irish, both in their work and personally. They are more self-respecting and better mannered, more agreeable in manners indeed. I've found them capable of the very highest cultivation of manner. One of our men has the education of a gentleman and is improving himself constantly. The other is ignorant, but is exceedingly refined and modest in manner. Of course they have faults. They are fickle, changing from place to place, even when they are fond of their employers, and they have quick tempers, but they are truthful and honest. We have never lost a thing by them. We keep them by preference and shall continue to do so." Several employers agree in regard to this instinct of the colored people for good manners. One who constantly employs 9 servants, and in the last 25 or 30 years has had only 1 set of white servants, says there is much more to them than people think. Our first manservant has as many of the instincts of a gentleman as any one I ever saw. This is high praise. They have a native deep-seated refinement and very lovely manners, says another who has employed them for 15 years. A judgment which was frequently encountered, and always among those employers who had had experience of both white and colored servants, was that colored servants are just like other people of their own class. One employer says on this point, "I don't find a bit of difference. Some are very neat and some are very untidy. It depends entirely on the girl." Another says there are good ones and poor ones among both. It varies with the individual, not with the race. Another, in charge of a large institution, employing many servants, of whom half are white and half colored, says, "My experience has been very satisfactory with the colored. They are less impertinent, but in most respects are much like white people of their own class. One is about as faithful as the other, and in the matter of neatness they are just like other people. It is 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. As to trustworthiness, I have found certain ones are perfectly reliable, just as with other human beings. Those who are interested in this subject will doubtless see that, although these opinions of employers have no statistical value, they will have a practical value for many readers, and especially if they open the eyes of the Philadelphia public, or even a small part of it, to the hitherto apparently unsuspected fact that there are grades among colored people just as there are among white people, and among colored servants as among white servants, that they are just like other human beings, some of them trustworthy and others not, some of them perfectly reliable, and others the opposite of what that phrase expresses, exactly as with white people of their own class. To class the whole race together, or to class all colored domestics together, is to make a serious mistake. End of section 7. Section 8 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conjugal Condition, Illiteracy, and Health of Negro Domestics. Conjugal Condition. A study of census statistics in connection with the results of this investigation seems to show a remarkably close parallel between the conjugal statistics of men servants, white and colored. The disproportionate number of single white women is accounted for by the great number of unmarried foreign-born white women in American domestic service. This seems to corroborate the opinion of those employers who found colored people very much like other human beings. Illiteracy: 9.6% of the men and 24.8% of the women in domestic service are illiterate in some degree, with a total percentage of 20.7 illiterate, either wholly or in part, while 80% of the colored men and women in domestic service have at least a common school education. 14% of the total count will be seen to have had some training above that of the common schools, or to have attended an industrial school. The illiteracy of Negro servants is about 2% greater than that of the total Negro population of the 7th Ward. This is doubtless to be accounted for by the fact that 70% of colored domestic servants are women, and the illiteracy of colored women is uniformly greater than that of colored men. This will be seen by glancing at the percents of illiteracy for colored men and women servants, 9.6% as opposed to 24.8%, and in the total population, 14.2% as opposed to 24.1%. In the whole population, the sexes are about evenly balanced in numbers. Hence, in the general average for the illiteracy of the whole population, the rates for each sex would bear an equal part in the general result. A comparison of these averages shows that the men in domestic service are somewhat less illiterate than the men in the whole population, while the women in domestic service appear to be slightly behind the women of the whole population. The question will arise as to the relative illiteracy of Negro domestics and of other domestics the country over. It is interesting to make the comparison. The census of 1890 gives the percentage of male illiterates in domestic and personal service at 18.9. This is the rate for all men servants in America 10 years old and over, and includes all nationalities, the native whites, foreign-born whites, and colored. It is less creditable than the record of the Philadelphia colored population by nearly 5 points, the record for Philadelphia's male Negroes 10 years old and over being but 14.2%. And it is only about half as creditable as the record of colored domestic men servants, their percent of illiteracy amounting to only 9.6%. The margin of error in the last is probably large, however, since it is computed upon but 156 cases. The census shows for female domestic service the country over, including both native and foreign white and colored women over 10 years of age, a percent of illiteracy amounting to 24.75. Among colored women servants in Philadelphia, 24.80 are found to be illiterate. The whole colored population of Philadelphia improves slightly upon this, showing for its women and girls 24.1% of illiteracy. This comparison seems to indicate that the grade of intelligence of women's servants, white and colored, is practically the same, while the colored men's servants are of a higher grade of intelligence than are white men servants. The investigator is inclined to think that the average of illiteracy for colored men servants, though computed on so few records, fairly represents the real conditions. It is not difficult to account for the great difference in records of colored and of white men servants when one remembers the facts so often referred to of the crowding out of competent and educated colored men who have been clerks, teachers, and skilled workmen, and who at one time or another have found themselves in a position where they were obliged to take domestic service or nothing. Large numbers of such men in the ranks of domestic service would bring down the percentage of illiteracy very decidedly. That it should reach the point of 9.6% is very creditable to the colored men's servants, if the figures are correct, since the percent of illiteracy for native white males is not quite 4 points ahead of it, being given by the census as 5.83%. Health statistics for domestic servants. The questions: number of days sick in last 12 months, nature of illness, were answered by 547 domestic servants. It is seen that 80% of the men have not been ill at all during the year, while among the women 74% have been exempt from illness. It is noteworthy that the slightest illness appears to have been conscientiously reported upon, since very nearly one-third of the men reporting illness were cases of colds or other such slight troubles as kept them ill only a day or two, while rather more than one-third of the women also scrupulously reported such insignificant illnesses. In this paper, however, the example of the Commission of Labor has been followed, and colds have not been counted at all. Wherever, therefore, an illness of 1 or 2 days is reported, it is of more serious nature than a mere cold. Of the 547 persons reporting, 3.1% report serious illness, of which 2.6% belongs to the women, and the remaining 0.5% to the men. The most prevalent troubles are consumption, la grippe, quinsy, sore throat, rheumatism, neuralgia, chills and fever or dyspepsia, and inflammation, which latter term appears to be a general name for all discomforts of the inner domestic, from indigestion to peritonitis and sudden death. Of those reporting illness, 7 of the 31 men will be seen to have been ill 1 week or less, while 33 of the 102 women were ill 1 week or less. One maid reports a severe attack of la grippe, but she worked all the same, losing not 1 day of work in the year. This is no uncommon fact, but the several of those reporting illness lose no time from work. While the women's sick list shows 33 ill 1 week or less, it shows 69 who had had longer periods of illness. Among the longest periods reported are the following: out of work for 3 months on account of trouble with the eyes, an operation for cataract. Another, out 3 or 4 months on account of weak lungs, says, I never can work more than a few weeks to a time. Another laid up 3 months with a sprained ankle. Another sick from March to Christmas with rheumatism. Another 4 months sick with rheumatism, but worked. Another 5 months sick with nervous shock caused by sudden death of her husband in an accident. One man has chills and fever from time to time all the year round. Another had rheumatism all winter but lost no working time. A comparison of the length of illness tabulated show that the records just quoted are unusual. Of the aggregate 450 weeks of illness during the year, is distributed among 547 persons, giving an average loss of work time for illness of about 4/5 of a week per individual during the year. Health of colored domestic servants in the 7th Ward during the last 12 months shows that there is a very high percentage of wellness and minimal illness of week or less, and even fewer more than 1 week. End of section 8. Section 9 of Special Report on Negro Domestic Service in the 7th Ward, Philadelphia, by Isabel Eaton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ideals of Betterment. In view of the general purpose of this investigation, it is proper to discuss in conclusion the question of the improvement of Philadelphia Negro domestic service. In the first place, what remedies or improvements in domestic service have already been tried with any measure of success? The answer to this question should indicate the lines along which progress may be expected. The only 2 scientific studies of the subject up to the present time are those of Mr. Charles Booth and of Miss Salmon, who in 1897 published her 300-paged book entitled Domestic Service. Mr. Booth's treatment of the subject is purely statistical, simply stating and grouping facts. It has no theory of betterment to offer. But Miss Salmon, besides giving statistics of American domestic service, also treats the question in its historical aspects and considers it philosophically and practically with an eye to its probable future development and to possible remedies for present difficulties. Hence the best, perhaps the only answer to the above question now to be found in print is that given by Miss Salmon in the closing chapters of her book, and a brief abstract of those chapters is therefore given here with her permission. Before suggesting any plan of betterment, Miss Salmon enumerates and discards various doubtful remedies, such as the removal of all difficulties by the application of the Golden Rule, employing the system of service books in vogue in Germany, introducing domestic training in the public schools, and other methods. All these plans fail, says the author, because they assume that the adjustment to be made is a purely personal one, whereas larger relations, political, economic, industrial, and social, are in point of fact involved. And she believes that reform in domestic service, if it is to succeed, must be accomplished along the same general economic lines as are reforms in other great departments of labor. She shows that domestic service, though apparently isolated from other departments of the world's work, has been powerfully affected by inventions, by political revolutions and social changes, by the commercial development of the country and the introduction of the factory system, which took out of the household once and for all the making of men's garments, many kinds of woolenware, boots and shoes, hats, gloves, etc., together with the preparation of many kinds of food, now made chiefly in factories, cheese, canned vegetables, ice cream, etc. Having shown that domestic labor is not isolated, but forms an integral and closely interwoven part of the social fabric, the author turns to consider possible remedies which can succeed only as they harmonize with the all-pervasive economic tendencies of modern times. Miss Salmon first enumerates these tendencies and declares them to be: 1. The tendency toward concentration of capital on labor in industry, shown in pools, trusts, department stores, etc. 2. The tendency toward specialization in every department of labor. 3. The tendency toward collective action growing from 1 and 2. 4. The tendency toward profit sharing and similar methods constantly becoming more far-reaching. 5. The tendency toward greater industrial independence of women. The first of the remedies suggested by Miss Salmon as running in harmony with these tendencies is specialization of household employments. This is an important point deserving of most careful consideration. It is true that all advancement yet made in household employments has involved division of labor and unconscious cooperation. As, for instance, when spinning and weaving, once done by the women at home, was removed to the factory; next, when the sewing machine took the making of underclothing largely out of the home and made of it the white goods industry. Cheese, a home product till 1860, is now wholly factory made. It is important to notice that all these articles, both of food and clothing, though at first more expensive when factory made, are now both better and more cheaply made outside the household. The presumption is that other activities are in a transition state, such, for example, as preserves, jellies, pickles, bread, cake, pastry, pressed meats, condensed milk, butter, etc., would soon be among those things made both better and more cheaply out of the house than within, were the demand for them sufficient. These things, if purchased through women's exchanges, are more expensive only because the demand for them has thus far been limited. The author believes that their cheapening would follow upon their greater demand, together with improved quality, as has been the case with clothing, etc. She shows further that the delivery of practically all articles of food ready for the final application of heat is possible through business enterprise and scientific experiment, and believes that this would go a long way toward solving the servant question by taking most of the domestics out of the house, and thus lessening the strain of personal relations of employer and employee. Employers would welcome such a change. The situation would be improved for the employees also, since many women could retain their home life and at the same time earn money and support their families. This change, it is pointed out, is in direct line with the tendency towards specialization everywhere else found, in that it enables each person to do exclusively that thing which she can do best. It allows the concentration of labor and capital, and thus economizes and secures the largest results. It retains the woman's home life without sacrificing her breadwinning opportunities. It improves the quality of products thus made under the most favorable conditions. It brings the work of every cook into competition with the work of every other cook, and thus incites improvement. It applies the principle of unconscious cooperation, and thus harmonizes with other business activities. That the laundry department also could thus be taken outside the household will not be questioned, since Troy laundries already do many articles better and more cheaply than can be done at home. Troy prices would lessen with increased demand and competition among laundries. The care of lawns, gardens, and orchards in summer, and of furnaces in winter, also tends to become a business in itself, and many cases are recorded of men who care for 8 or 10 different furnaces, or who have charge of from 10 to 15 lawns or gardens, and of women who wash windows once a week for a large number of families. There are many reasons why this tendency should develop. It is much in its favor, while the only objection to it, that the cost of living would be increased, is not valid, since it is certain that the added expense would only be temporary, as in the case of the factory-made garments, and would finally operate decidedly to cheapen living expenses. The second possible remedy suggested is profit sharing, and its application to housework is interesting. It is possible, says Miss Salmon, to fix a sum as $50 or $100 for monthly expenses, including food, fuel, lights, a pro rata for guests, etc. If by care in the use of materials the expenses amount to but $45 or $90 monthly, the $5 or $10 saved can be divided according to a proportion previously agreed upon between the employer and the employees. The cook was in a position to save most, receiving the greatest percentage of the bonus. Domestics thus become interested partners in the concern, and with most satisfactory results. Miss Salmon states that this is not untested theory, but has been successfully practiced and actually does place the household on a business basis. A third possible remedy proposed is thorough education in household science. It is maintained that the organization of a great professional school, fully equipped for the study of domestic science and open only to graduates of the leading colleges and universities, would start household science in the right direction, that in which advancement in all other occupations has been made, and thus make possible true progress and further harmonious development in this belated industry. The result, should these remedies be applied on a large scale, Miss Salmon believes, would be far-reaching and of inestimable value. She says this readjustment of work and the willingness of large numbers of women to work for remuneration would be as productive of improvement in all household affairs as division of labor has been elsewhere. A far-reaching benefit is suggested by Maria Mitchell when she says the dressmaker should no more be a universal character than the carpenter. Suppose every man should feel it his duty to do his own mechanical work of all kinds, would society be benefited? Would the work be well done? Yet a woman is expected to know how to do all kinds of sewing, all kinds of cooking, all kinds of any woman's work, and the consequence is that life is passed in learning these only, while the universe of truth beyond remains unentered. It must be said in conclusion, the author continues, that little can be accomplished in domestic reform except through the use of means which already exist, developing these along lines marked out by industrial progress in other fields. This brief extract gives the gist of the best thought thus far devoted to the subject. Now we must ask ourselves, how can all this be applied to Negro domestic service in Philadelphia? What facts now existing in service there can be laid hold of and developed along these lines of progress observed in other fields of industry? Most of the facts of Negro domestic service which are amenable to such adaptation and development are to be found under the head of specialization of employments. Considerable outside service is already being done by colored people in Philadelphia. The degree to which laundry work, for example, has been removed from the household may be seen by the fact that there are but 31 private laundresses in the ward, while 1,097 colored women in the ward support their families by taking in washing or doing day's work, as they call washing by the day, at the employer's house. There is every evidence that sending out the washing instead of keeping a laundress as one of the regular domestics is more satisfactory both to employer and employee, for the laundress would rather do the work at home, and often must do it there or not at all, when there are young children in her family, while the employer gains a peaceful Monday and Tuesday by having the work done out, besides saving the slight but constant expense of coal and washing supplies. Aside from these 1,097 individual laundresses in the ward, there are also 2 regular laundries managed by Negro families, where all the working members of the family are busily employed for 6 days in the week with the work of a large number of families. Such colored people as these are justly jealous of the work given to Chinamen, while many native Negroes cannot get work to do. There is no doubt that successful and excellent laundries would grow up under the management of Philadelphia colored men and women, if employers could be dissatisfied to put the washing out and to admit the possibility of having clothing laundered on some other weekday than that which was usual in the Plymouth colony. The domestic economy of America today is more complex than was that of the Plymouth colony, and we can very easily make due allowance for the fact by letting our laundresses choose their own Monday. Another branch of domestic work showing the specializing tendency is that known as general work, which with men servants usually denotes care of furnaces, cleaning the front of the house, etc. Nearly all of these men do such work for a considerable number of families and devote their entire time to it. One man was encountered who was in charge of the furnaces and outside work of not less than 8 different establishments. In this direction, employers could easily cooperate to effect further specialization, as only a little over 2% of Negro male wage earners are at present general workers. It was observed that such men were found almost exclusively in the more fashionable and wealthy quarter, while elsewhere the waiter manservant undertook the outside work as part of his duty. The specializing tendency in this department of Negro service is much less marked than in the laundry work. Still, progress in the right direction is practicable, since the tendency, though not greatly developed, still exists. A much more significant fact in the matter of specialization of work is the presence in the Seventh Ward alone of 83 colored caterers and cateresses, whose employment by families who entertain to any extent surely diminishes the need in those families for the services of such large numbers of domestics as would otherwise be employed by them. The use of such outside professional help is clearly a development in the right direction, and the service thus secured is manifestly better because skilled. It is equally evident that it is cheaper to employ a caterer periodically than to keep an extra number of trained domestics permanently employed in the household for such occasions. Here again, then, specialization is found actually at work among the colored people of Philadelphia. A fourth instance of it, which is found in the city, is worth citing. This is a woman's exchange, the preparation of foods such as fruit in glass jars, preserves, jellies, pickles, etc., and the making of simple garments, underwear, aprons, shirtwaists, babies' caps, etc., are the kinds of work specialized upon by the Exchange for Women's Work, located at 756 South 12th Street in connection with the parsonage of Bethel Church. This exchange is outside the Seventh Ward, but is so notable a case of the tendency here discussed that it seems well to mention it. The articles offered for sale are of excellent quality and are sold at moderate prices. The investigator has noticed in a high-grade provision store in Chestnut Street, not far from Rittenhouse Square, that jellies, jams, and fruits are offered for sale bearing conspicuous sale cards marked Miss So-and-so's pickled peaches, Miss So-and-so's currant jelly, etc. This suggests that there might be an exchange for colored women's work at such provision stores and high-grade groceries if the proprietors could be induced to cooperate, as many of them doubtless could be by judicious and business-like suggestions from their leading customers or from some well-known and influential organization of women. Colored women who have unusual skill in the preparation of any kind of foods might in this way be able to place their goods advantageously, greatly to their own benefit and also to that of the community of which they form often an unemployed part. To sum up, the facts of colored domestic service, which can be laid hold of and developed along the lines of specialization of household work, then, are these facts connected with extra service. 1. Laundry work can be done more conveniently and as cheaply or more cheaply outside of the house than within it, and many excellent laundresses among the married colored women are anxious to get such work to do. 2. Outside work, furnace work, etc., can similarly be done by men making it their business, and a man servant thus be left free for other duties or dispensed with altogether. 3. Patronage of caterers rather than the employment of supernumerary domestics is a step tending to simplify household work in large establishments, and the employment of competent colored caterers a step tending to simplify the problem of unemployed colored men in Philadelphia. 4. Anything tending to extend the patronage of exchanges for women's work, and by inducing competition in such work to cheapen articles so offered for sale, is a step in the direction of taking food preparation outside the household, and anything tending to secure a steady sale for the work of skilled colored cooks in such exchanges is a step in the direction of solving the colored unemployed problem of Philadelphia with all the degradation and suffering implied in that problem. In regard to the second possible remedy proposed by Miss Salmon, it can only be said that the method of profit sharing is as practicable with colored as with white or foreign employees, perhaps more so since colored domestics are proverbially anxious to please. The third possible remedy suggested, thorough education in household affairs, aims to remove the odium now attaching to domestic service and to attract competent people to the employment by raising it to the rank of a profession. The Philadelphia colored people have already thought this subject through for themselves. A woman physician who is well known in Philadelphia, one of the most intelligent and interesting women of either race, said to the present investigator, If domestic service were made more honorable, more tolerable, more human, it would not be so unpopular. If we had good training schools for service, it would become an honorable branch of business. Mr. Booker Washington believes in putting brains into common work, and that is just what I say about domestic labor. If a girl is taught to cook skillfully and to buy economically, she becomes a dignified laborer. A trained worker is always honorable and dignified. I've often said there should be a school to train domestics. Many girls want to work who can't get the opportunity. If you ask them, what do you understand doing? What do you represent? They say, I don't know how to do anything well. It is a most lamentable answer and a most common one, but they want to learn. If you ask, would you go and work for 50 cents a week and be trained? They will say yes willingly. And I believe that we should have a school of instruction with a regular course where graduates who reach a certain degree of excellence get a certificate of efficiency. Let this school be an employment bureau also. Such an arrangement would be a help both ways to the employees and to the competent among the employed. That this idea of Dr. Blank's could be made workable seems unquestionable when we study the situation in London, as shown by Mr. Booth. There the girls from the workhouse schools, who have only the merest rudiments of training in household affairs, are nevertheless in such demand in London service that, as Mr. Booth says, there is no difficulty in finding places for the girls from the workhouse schools, as the demand far exceeds the supply. The MABYS, Metropolitan Association for Befriending Young Servants, has organized an employment bureau where these young servant girls may be engaged, and at this office the protection of the girl is ensured by obliging the mistress to sign a form of agreement stating the number in her family, work required, wages paid, privileges granted, etc. The detailed workings of this bureau and its friendly connection with the girls after their places are secured are set forth fully in Mr. Booth's book. The chief thing to be noted here is the remarkable demand which actually exists for girls having any training at all, which fact leaves little doubt that the training does distinctly add to the value of the servant. A training school for domestic training could as easily be established in Philadelphia in connection with institutions already organized. The best-known colored institute in the city of Philadelphia is already doing admirable work in manual training and the teaching of trades, from the building trades to millinery and dressmaking. Would it not be practicable to add courses in domestic science and economy, chemistry and sanitation, etc., to which only graduates of the institute should be admitted, and where certificates should be granted only to graduates attaining a certain rank in their work, both theoretical and practical? An employment bureau in connection with such a training school could be undertaken on a fair business basis by some philanthropic or civic association to ensure fair treatment, as is done by the MABYS in London. Such a plan would undoubtedly be facilitated by the presence at the head of this particular institution at the present time of one of the most gifted and progressive women in Philadelphia, whose views on domestic service are the leading ones in modern domestic reform. In closing this paper, it may be well to point out that these suggestions, all of which are in line with the views of the best thinkers upon the subject of reform in the administration of household matters, would obviate in large measure the greatest difficulties in the domestic service of today. What are these difficulties? In England, the two greatest, in the opinion of Mr. Booth, are the dullness of the domestic servant's life and the difficulty of the personal relations between employer and employed. The same is true of American domestic service, with the added drawback of loss of social standing, which in this country is the greatest objection of all, though hardly consciously felt in England. When the domestic becomes a trained worker, honorable and dignified, this great objection will be removed, and it is clear that minimizing the number of domestics employed within the household would do away in large measure with the difficulty of the personal relations between mistress and maid, while the domestic, thus set free to perform their special work according to their own methods and in their own homes, would have no more reason to complain of the dullness of such life than a dressmaker or milliner would have. With the removal of these obstacles, better ability would enter domestic service, and the industry would become more honorable, as well as more endurable and attractive to domestics, who, we sometimes forget, are also human beings, and naturally wish to live the lives of human beings. End of section 9. End of special report on Negro domestic service by Isabel Eaton.